The world isn't just changing, it's being rewritten in real time, from media disruptions to geopolitical power shifts. Businesses are no longer just competing, they're fighting to stay ahead in an era of uncertainty. I'm John, and welcome to ExpertGate interview series. Today, I'm honored to be joined with Michael John Gill, a distinguished strategy consultant, creative innovator, and problem solver with extensive experience across international markets. Michael has led global businesses, strategies, and advised multinational clients on policy risk and played a key role in media and digital transformation. From pioneering the Australian Financial Review's digital transition to guiding companies through market entry and strategy execution in Asia, his expertise spans industries, geographies, and cutting edge business innovation. Michael, it's a pleasure to have you right with us today. Let's dive right in. Could you give us a bit of an understanding on your journey and what got you to specialize in your field?
Thanks, John. Up until December 24, I was head of Asia for an international consultancy called Dragoman. And the work I was doing in that period, about 11 years or something, was largely with multinational companies, generally speaking, with projects to do with Asia, either the influence of change in countries like China, the opportunities in countries like India or Indonesia or Japan, Vietnam and so on, and generally trying to figure out how the environment of those places was suited or unsuited to the interests of those companies. And in the case of China, of course, there's many dimensions to that, both their innovation base and their access as a market and so on. So that was the thing I was deeply into. And of course, it's become quite an important dynamic because the nature of things like trade has become a lot more complicated. You could almost say we had 20 odd years of almost frictionless global trade, and now all of a sudden there's a whole lot of complications that arise from policy and so on. So that was a pretty rich area for me. I've got a particular interest in some of the development attributes of some of those countries, and I've also done work as a volunteer in some of those countries in relation particularly to things like capacity building in the areas especially of education and vocational skills. In fact, I was chairman of an organisation called Sustainable Skills, which is all about helping in capacity building around especially vocational skills.
Okay. Now, you talked about this, frictionless trade and capacity building for those vocational skills. You, Michael, you've worked across a whole different kind of sectors with digital transformation to policy analysis. Now, following on from that, what types of projects or collaborations are you most excited to take part with through ExpertGate?
Well, I think in general, the sorts of things I've developed a capability in and confidence in is really understanding how the sort of dynamics of different economies and different policy environments affect opportunities, whether they be public or private sector, and really try to understand how someone's intent can engage with what those countries actually want to achieve and the way they want to achieve them. So I think in many ways it's about understanding those dynamics and understanding the environments that affect people's choices in terms of engagement on things like infrastructure, health services, different forms of technology and so on. The other thing that I suppose, I've got a background in was because before I became a consultant, I had 30 odd years in media, and 15 of those years were as a chief executive of the Financial Review Group, which had obviously a big presence in Australia, but also quite a lot of operations in Asia. And a lot of that experience was about business strategy, functional change, trying to deal with a very dynamic market that was changing fundamentally in terms of how consumers behaved, and trying to make the processes of that business move in a direction that was capable of meeting the change in value proposition. So I've got a bit of both. I've got a bit of commercial knowledge. I've got a lot of the sort of experience that business journalists have in traveling around the world and living in various parts of the world. And I've got this sort of other attribute where I spend a lot of time trying to help people understand how to approach a particular market or a different culture or something like that.
Lovely, lovely. I mean, Michael, I mean, you with your time as leading the Financial Review, your background and work in strategy, education, digital transformation, it's really reshaped and shaped industries. Now, how do you see your expertise contributing now to a positive social impact in the communities and businesses that you serve?
Well, I guess one of the insights that you
Mm,
have that you learn from, I guess,
yeah.
having the sort of access that people, especially in business journalism, can have, is that you get to understand that decisions aren't just made by things like you know governments. They're not impersonal. There are people behind decisions both in politics and in business,
Yes.
and it's the what drives the decision. Why do people make those decisions? What influences them? What are the important things to understand about how decisions are made? I think having a bit of a sense of how things happen
Mm,
is a constructive thing to know, because quite often I think people approach things from a kind of a literal appreciation of what someone or what governments might have said, rather than understanding that quite often these things are there's a space in there where things could change if you understand what people are trying to achieve. What's their purpose and what are their
mm,
goals. So I think that particular attribute, in my experience, where I've spent a lot of time listening to and talking with people who make those sorts of decisions, both in governments and in business, is something that I think you sort of you pick up as a learned experience, which you can then apply to different situations.
Oh, well, wonderfully said, Michael. For at the end of the day, it's when regardless of whether you're dealing with business or government, you're dealing with people
Mm,
directly, and they're going to be the ones who are the decision makers,
mm,
and whatever strategies they put forward are going to have great impact on the communities and businesses in that industry, right?
mm.
Now, for ExpertGate, we dedicate 50% of our profits to Industry 5.0 centered initiatives for underprivileged communities. Now, how do you think these efforts can be further enhanced? And what roles can universities and industries play in this mission?
Well, I'm very pleased that you do that, actually, and I've dedicated a bit of my own time in a similar way to volunteer efforts. And the one thing I'm confident of, and I have learned a lot about, is that Australia, in particular, and many other countries, have attributes that could be very helpful to these people, and it's not an expensive thing to provide, which is the capacity to develop expertise. And
Mm,
whether you go to a country like Vietnam, where there's a cabinet level appointment, which is largely about trying to build their capacity with skills and vocational skills in particular,
mm,
or Indonesia, which has been the policy for the last 3 terms of government. These things are really important to those communities, and some countries, particularly Australia, have the sort of structure of delivery for some of these things that really is valuable to them. And it's not about, a lot of people think of these things as aid projects. It's really about a cultural exchange which involves expertise. It's not about a giant bucket of money. It's about actually
mm.
showing people how to design systems and to use the assets they have available to them to deliver the outcome they want. And I'm afraid I haven't been successful in convincing Australian institutions to do that, too much of that, although I was pretty successful with one. But I
Mm.
do think it's an area where there's a lot of potential.
Oh, yeah, and definitely, definitely. And the way that you put it, and a cultural exchange with expertise, right? These kind of things. It's hands-on. It's not just as you mentioned, in dumping a bucket of money for aid. That's why we understand at ExpertGate, building these communities through education is so, more so important now than ever. Now, with Industry 5.0, it's really shaping the future of higher education. Mike, what from your perspective, right? What roles do you think then, for going from that, will universities play in shaping this education and preparing students now for a more AI-driven yet human-centered workforce?
Well, I think there's a few ways to think about it, but the kind of holistic thing that you can see in the countries that don't have significant migration,
Yeah.
most of the OECD is now in population decline. And most of what that means effectively is that the fundamental driver of GDP and the growth that we've all assumed as the key measure of our welfare is not as the same dynamic as it was. And then you've got, in addition to that, quite a lot of significant technological change that will bring very substantial benefits. And the question mark then is, how do you change in the end the outcomes that are going to produce, confident, stable, healthy societies? And those questions, I think, are not simply about the mechanics of technology or the mechanics of science. It's a lot of it is about understanding how the people's welfare will work. And, if there are various good examples of it, but the one I've been a bit focused on actually is on China's, because they have a number of things working both for and against them in one go. And I think that some of the things that they are trying to do are going to be very much worth looking for. But in our immediate region, we've got some very young populations. Indonesia and India, for example, have both got a demographic dividend yet to be banked if they can do it properly. And Japan, Korea, and China are all past the curve of their populations in decline, and maybe Korea's the more exaggerated of those. And some of those countries don't lend themselves well to migration, so they're going to have have a very sharp focus on how to solve that problem. If you like, the distribution of value creation and the distribution of consumption, that's going to be really important to how technology works for them or not. And I think, in our country, we benefit from the ability to absorb migration reasonably stably. Those countries don't. And there's things there that we really should focus on to understand how the economics, the technology, and the social fabric interengage, because that to me is the one that you have to understand if you're going to avoid the sorts of negative consequences that you see in the politics of some countries where there's deep resentment and it manifests itself particularly in the form of xenophobia.
Definitely. It's very important to be wary of these things so that you don't go down that track and you lead down to, as you said, xenophobia and further kind of negative attributes flowing on from it.
Yep.
Now, Michael, thank you so much for sharing your insights. Your experience across media, strategy, and global business is truly inspiring for our viewers. If you want to learn more about Michael's work on consulting and contributing towards creating a more confident, stable, and healthy society, or ExpertGate's mission, check out the links in the description below at expertgate.org. And remember, ExpertGate for everyone, everywhere.